we have something called the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically what happened was the religious community, specifically the Pope, gave those that followed the Catholic way of life permission to conquer, to kill, to destroy indigenous peoples and get their lands if they were not Christians, and to declare that land theirs. And so they set off across the oceans, and that's exactly what they did. The very first person to declare our land was the Spanish. Then it was the French. The French came, and of course they declared all of the Great Lakes theirs.
When the British came in and defeated the French, they assumed a sovereignty over this piece of eastern North America. That's how arrogant the British are, right? They just assumed we have sovereignty over this piece of land, over New France, and over the 13 colonies. Jeffrey Amherst, we're hearing about that right now. There's statues to Amherst and Jeffrey Amherst. Yeah, he was a racist. He became the commander-in-chief of British forces after 1759. And Amherst thought that he captured Quebec, Louisbourg, and Montreal. It broke the back of the French Empire, and he thought he would be hailed as a hero. But then what happens? Pontiac.
So Pontiac was an incredible warrior. His whole body was covered with tattoos. And he was known to like the French. He did not like the British.
Pontiac attacks Fort Detroit and unleashes his fury on the British forts, and that becomes the yoke around Jeffrey Amherst's neck.
So during the Plains of Abraham, that's when the British defeated the French and were able to claim title over this land, which was Crown land. Of course, the indigenous people weren't having it. They were fighting the British at the time.
William Johnson was smart enough to know that we'll never win a war against the Great Lakes tribes, so we have to appease them in another way. It was William Johnson who helped to orchestrate Jeffrey Amherst's removal back to Britain, because he was a land speculator. William Johnson, he was big time. And he was married into the Six Nations. Talk about a conflict of interest. And he reversed the Amherst policy of no alcohol. We don't hear about that. We don't hear about what that did. Go back to your communities and unleash your chaos against yourselves. Murder yourselves, because we don't care. The whole British concept of being able to gain a foothold in eastern North America would be accomplished if the people can destroy themselves.
So at the time when Sir William Johnson was the authority for the British in dealing with Indians, the native people were getting big barrels of whiskey that was just full of poison, and they were dying from this poisoned whiskey. And it was Sir William Johnson that turned those policies around so that the indigenous people could be traded whiskey for lands and for furs. So they say that we're a nation in that particular document. I don't care. Our lands were claimed by the British and stolen, and that's the founding document. The French and the British fought. It was the British that defeated the French, and then they came up with the Royal Proclamation and said, "This is Crown land. You are a nation. Do not sell your land to the French."
The Royal Proclamation established a line. It was really the British were concerned about the American colonists. There was nothing happening here, right? pre-1763, nothing. So they struck a line along the crest of the Appalachians, and they said there couldn't be no settlement west of the Appalachians. It was happening in the 1750s. In the 1740s, that settlement was pushing west. And you had these land companies that would be struck, and they were speculating, and they were doing their own treaties with the Six Nations, and so it was doomed for failure.
Sir William Johnson gave Pontiac medals, and actually gave everybody medals at the Treaty of Niagara. Lots of chief got medals. And on the medals, they had fires and piles of wood on there, and also a sun, to represent that the Indigenous people's fire were always going to burn bright, that there was always going to be lots of wood to be put in there, and that for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows, we would never be molested by the British, and that our homelands would always be ours. So as long as the sun shines and the grass grows is a terminology that the British came up with, because they believed that the sun would never set on the British Empire. And so this was part of their theme of world domination. And of course it's coded right into the medals, it's coded right into the Royal Proclamation, and of course later on it's symbolic in every agreement after, until of course they lost their power to democracy.
The proclamation said that wherever we need land for settlement, we will treat with the First Nations that are affected. And so the Royal Proclamation establishes the modern treaty process.
And so the Royal Proclamation was used as an agreement so that the Indians at the time, or so-called Indians, wouldn't sell their land to the French. And it was actually a Doctrine of Discovery proclamation to secure stolen lands. So the Royal Proclamation is, of course, the grandfather document of it's the beginning of the paper trail of how our lands got stolen.
Even though it was doomed, the Royal Proclamation still has that important piece in there about how land has to be taken up, and then where it's not taken up, it remains the Indian hunting ground. So that's the key, right? That's critical.
So during this whole treaty process, the populations of Indigenous people were very, very low. You had influenza, you had outbreaks of smallpox, and also they say that half of the population around the Great Lakes were diminished during the War of 1812.
The borderlands were sealed after the War of 1812. That sort of severs the Great Western Confederacy, you know, our people and those tribes on the other side of the American border. You have now the British realize that the border is vulnerable. The border has been breached 4 times by the Americans. Shadow Gay, Chrysler's Farm, York, and Detroit. And so the British now need to secure land in from the old treaties. Whoever could build the first mills, they were those guys were the ones that became the real important people in the growing communities. So then the ecology starts to change. You start to flood the streams and the rivers, and that's going to change the ecology. Colonial drainage laws come down in 1835. So farmers now have the authority or the ability now to drain the land. There's the Union that occurs in 1841, and the province of Canada is created out of that.
The British had everything mapped out. They had all of the copper and the nickel and the white pine. They had all of the gold, all mapped out. And so once the land was secured as crown land from the Americans, and had eliminated any threat from the Americans, then they went into full-on resource extraction. That was the whole plan from the beginning.
And then the Bagot Commission occurs, and that now takes on the Indian problem. Out of the Bagot Commission comes this idea of the industrial school. And so it's a predecessor of the residential school. T.G. Anderson, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, he comes to the communities and he says to the people, we would like the smaller reserve communities to move to those communities, participate in this industrial school. And so the chiefs agreed that we will provide 1/4 of our annuity money to help support the schools. And they buy into this scheme because they believe that education will help our people survive. Why did they do that? Because our people are still de facto self-governing. It's pre-Confederation, right? Our people control their treaty money, they control their membership, and they control their land and resources. What's left of it?
So after the Robinson, Huron, and Superior treaties took place, of course the government just kept rolling on down the line. And they just named them Treaty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on. And so the numbered treaties fell shortly after the Great Lakes treaties. And by then, they had everything down packed. So what people, I think, need to know is that the numbered treaties are very different than the Superior Robinson treaties. And the Superior Huron treaties, there's absolutely no talk about healthcare, there's no talk about lodging, and there's no talk about education. And they didn't need those things from the British. But because of the smallpox and the eradication of the buffalo on the plains, thousands and thousands of Indigenous people were starving to death. And of course, it was the British, the Crown, that took advantage of that situation and implemented those three things, which is now the basis of the Indian Act.
So the plan of the industrial school has failed by 1861. In 12 years, it's failed. And so the plan shuts down, but the school, of course, stays there. Physically, it stays there. And then they just go on the provincial plan, whatever it was at the time. And then 1867, Confederation. Johnny MacDonald writes the majority of the British North America Act, includes Section 9124. And then that gives the Dominion of Canada federal authority to now control our people, as been said, from cradle to grave, and it gives them the legislative authority to then enact the Indian Act.
In 1876, that was a direct assault on the clan system. This is the system that was created for our extermination. This was not a brand new plan in 1876, if my research is right. The Gradual Civilization Act, which later became the Indian Act, began in 1857. So this is a 20-year plan on how to break down this system. In some communities, this was legally enforced. They held elections at gunpoint. And you had to be Christian to participate in those elections. And that's how the chief and council system came to be. That was a direct act of violence on our systems of governing. And then now what's happening today, this is no longer seen as legitimate, and chief and councils are misunderstood as our leadership. No, these are not accidents. This was complete and total political strategy to tear down every single institution of the Indigenous people that existed here.
See, when you buy land under the process, under treaty land entitlement, when you buy land, what you're saying is the Queen owns that land. That's what you're saying. And the Queen doesn't own that land. We own it. We own all the land. What they're doing is they never honored the treaties. So what they're doing is they're living here for free. They're living here for free. That's what they're doing. The Queen said that will hold this land in trust for you. So why would we let her hold that land in trust for us? That land is ours. The parks and the forest and all of that is ours yet. They can't hold it in trust. Why? Why are we allowing her to hold us in trust?
The reserve system wasn't supposed to last. It was an experiment. It was a school of civilization. We'll get them civilized and turn them into farmers, and then we can get rid of the Indian Reserve, because then we've created the enfranchisement policies, and enfranchisement will now allow us to remove the reserve off the political map.
How we seen the reserve boundary was very simple, was that was a place where the indigenous people could stay, and that was going to be used for them, and that the settlers were not allowed to live on there. But that didn't mean that we were to be contained on there. It didn't mean that they couldn't live off the reserve. So the treaty was to protect their right to live off the reserve, with special protections for the reserve. But in actuality, the Crown turned it around and used the reserve as a place to colonize, and they started to remove the people off the lands so that there could be a free-for-all in resource extraction.
These were all acts of colonialism. And the only problem now is that this policy, coupled with residential school and like social engineering, all of that, the only problem is we're still existing through all these different, whether it was legislated genocide or it was all out physical genocide, or what do they call residential school? Cultural genocide. We were not supposed to be existing. We were supposed to be gone by now.
Here's the problem that we're running into now, is that Canada inherited these colored titles that they call treaties. They used them for a free-for-all in resource extraction, which is causing abrupt, irreversible climate change. And so I believe that it's time to move away from those agreements and to start working with real people on real issues that are very tangible in terms of how can we help the ecosystems. And the hope lies in regular people.
There's quotes that come down through history where the government agreed. These are a free and independent people. So in that is where the inherent rights lie. That we need the next generations to really start to pull the layers up, keep pulling the layers off, so that they can do what I'm doing, and so that they can hold the government to account. Because if you don't know your history, how do you sit across the table from Director General or whoever? How do you sit across the table and defend your cause or defend your community's history? How do you do that if you don't know the history? It's important.
Educate yourself about the truth. Find out the history of that land. Educate yourself. Become aware of that history of that land. To share that with the new students, to share that with your teachers, share that with your principals, share that out. Help us spread the truth about the land. Build a relationship with your local First Nation and community members.
We have to think about the history of our people and what they've been through and where we're at currently. We have the residential school system. We have the Indian Act. There's a generation that's there that there's been a disconnect because the transfer of knowledge didn't happen because there was a generation that was taken away. And so that's where the impacts of that's what we're living today. That's what we're living today. And it's like, okay, this generation that's running our reserve, they can't connect because that spirit is not there, because the hereditary chiefs, they're gone now. There's some people that don't even know that they're from those lines, that they are hereditary chiefs. The responsibilities from our clan systems, people don't know their clans, they don't know their names, they don't know that We came here with these gifts that the Creator gave us. It's still there. It's still in our communities. There's still language speakers. It's a small speck in the whole aspect of things, but it's still there. That's the thing. So if we can just, ignite that and empower our people to believe in our own ways, then I believe that we can, stand our people back up again to believe in our ways.
Treaty means agu diwin. Agu diwin means whatever you have, you'll always retain that. You'll always have that. You'll have the land. You'll have the everything. You always have that. But what we give you will be on top of what you have. Agu diwin. That's what that means. Doesn't mean a right. It means agu diwin. That's what that means.